Welcome to the latest episode of The Independent. I'm Pete Sampson, off-season Pete Sampson, back in South Bend after the national championship game. He's Matt Fortuna in Chicago. And Matt, I think the last time we had a podcast, it was 3:45 in the morning. I was drinking a Heineken and yawning. A little bit more with it now. And there's been plenty of stuff. Some we saw coming, some less so with Notre Dame. But probably best to start with the defensive coordinator position, which is the one we saw coming. Al Golden out the road to Cincinnati. However, I'm not sure when we were podcasting, either of us would have predicted Chris Ash as the incoming.
No, I think I told you this off air. The day Al Golden officially left for Cincinnati, I got a text from someone at Rutgers who was like, Chris Ash is interested. And I was just like, what's he doing now? And I'm still not sure. I guess he was scouting for the Jaguars this past year.
Yeah.
He's got, nothing to like for like comparison. If you wanted to draw a through line between Al Golden to him, you can see it. Previous head coach experience, been a coordinator everywhere, Arkansas, Wisconsin, Texas, Ohio State, comes from the Urban Meyer, Brett Bielema. Obviously had a terrible tenure at Rutgers, but I think everyone in the history of Rutgers outside of Greg Schiano has had a terrible head coaching tenure there. So I wouldn't hold that against him, but it's definitely a bit of an off the beaten path hire. And, there were some other names that, me and you had reported on who were potentially involved as well. I don't think outside of Jim Knowles, there was a Marcus Freeman equivalent as far as must get DC out there. So I'll be curious to see how this plays out. Certainly there's a Mike Mickens factor. Twitter's decided he's the second coming of Vince Lombardi. With all due respect to Mike Mickens, I think highly of him as a coach. I don't know if I'd go that far just yet, but it does sound like he's going to stay in a co-coordinator role with a likely pay bump. But as far as how it's going to work out, I mean, I'll be blunt. I have no idea. The guy's last act, I take that back. He was the DC at Texas during the COVID year. That staff got fired with Tom Herman. But, as far as how it's going to work with Notre Dame's personnel and meshing with his staff, I do not know. This was not a guy who was on, I think, any of our radars, as recently as the end of the playoff run.
No, it was, I think, probably late last week where I was checking with some sources, and the four names I'd heard were Jim Leonard, Brian Haynes, Joe Rossi, and Chris Ash. And I was like, all right, well, Chris Ash reminded me a lot of Al Golden from the last time around. It's not exactly the same. Chris Ash was with the Jaguars and the Raiders. Al Golden was in the Super Bowl with the Bengals. That's a lot different.
I would add Al Golden had maybe the greatest rebuilding job in modern college history.
He had success as a head coach, and then middling, not good enough at Miami. Chris Ash was an epic disaster at Rutgers. It was basically he was Purdue of last year, but at Rutgers. That they were that bad. So I don't know how relevant that is. I've tried to point out to people it's two completely different jobs to be a head coach and a defensive coordinator. One doesn't predict success of the other or portend failure. So I don't think that has a whole lot to do. I do think the thing with Chris Ash that is identical to Al Golden is you have to come to Notre Dame with a staff that's already assembled and then fit in with that staff. If Chris Ash comes to Notre Dame thinking I'm going to fix this defense, or I'm going to change this defense, or I'm going to put my stamp on this defense, I would hope not. The defense was pretty damn good under Al Golden. Was very good under Marcus Freeman, great under Clark Lee, very good under Mike Elko. Just come in and put back together what is the very good pieces that are already sitting there for you in the Goog. So that's I would assume that Marcus Freeman, being kind of a high emotionally intelligent guy, would have imparted this to Chris Ash, that we're not looking for you to come in and reinvent the wheel. So just come in, run your stuff, but the culture is what we set it to be. It's not Urban Meyer culture. I think that we both heard some stuff about Chris Ash, kind of a hard ass, some more Van Gorder vibes, I guess is probably the best way to put it, in terms of personality. But if you're following Urban Meyer's lead, you're going to behave one way. If you're following Marcus Freeman's lead, you're going to behave a completely different way. So I think that that's an important distinction, or a difference to draw between, or just at least note with Chris Ash coming to Notre Dame.
I'll ask you this, because I haven't heard anything concrete either way. Were the players involved with this at all? Because you hear a lot about that when it comes to position,
I had
position
not
coach
heard.
hires, coordinator hires,
Yeah,
etc.
I had not heard that at all. And I, frankly, the offensive coordinator search of a couple years ago probably put an end to player feedback because that
It put an
absolutely.
end. I can tell you this. Thank you, Harry Stan. It put an end to other staff, other coaches' feedback sitting on interviews.
Yeah,
I know that
yeah,
for a fact.
yeah. It's that the head coach has to decide, and I think Marcus Freeman has had some big hits with staff hires, and he's had some misses with staff hires. But I have said this before, and probably bears repeating. There are very few things that we are less qualified to do than tell you how a assistant coach hire will fit in with a staff. Like we just don't know. When Harry Heastan was hired in 2012, the feedback was Tennessee's offensive line was terrible. This will never work. This guy can't recruit. Like what a complete mess. Like okay, that worked out pretty well. People were not enthused about Al Golden 3 years ago. Clark Lee was a huge gamble. I think we knew Mike Elko was going to be good. Probably knew Marcus Freeman was going to be good as a defensive coordinator. And Notre Dame has hired hotshot assistants in the past before that haven't worked out. Like all due respect to Mike Sanford, but he was like a big name when they hired him. Didn't work out. So you just don't know. But I think if you're keeping Al Washington, Max Bulla, and Mike Mickens, and then I would assume Marty Biaggi would either rotate to a different position or just go back to special teams full times. Like Chris Ash would, I think, if you can't work together with that staff, then that would be kind of a shame on you situation.
I agree. This group's been together so long and it's been at multiple different places for the most part. I'm surprised that I know the Mike Pickens love has gone a little out of control, but I've been surprised how like Al Washington's just become kind of the forgotten man on this staff. I think he's done as good a job as anyone from an assistant position coach standpoint. And the guy was the runner up, from what I was told, to get in the BC head job last year behind Bill O'Brien. So hopefully, I have no reason not to think this, but hopefully he handles all this lack of attention in stride as well. But I mean, it's a great question. Right? I mean, I don't think is this Al Golden would be different, but trying to think of a hire Marcus Freeman has made at Notre Dame who hasn't worked with anyone on staff previously.
I mean, other than Al Golden,
yeah,
right.
And even then, he was coming from Cincinnati. I'm sure they knew each other when he was with their Cats.
This goes way back, but Chris Ash did work with Joe Rudolph at Wisconsin.
That's right. But
so there is at least some, but that's 15 years ago at this point.
Offense or defense too, yeah.
Yeah. So at least there is that. And I do think it was interesting. You go through, like, if it was Jim Leonard, also worked at Wisconsin with Joe Rudolph more recently. But that was maybe something significant. I don't, and the other candidates, Bryant Haynes and
Joe Rossi.
Joe Rossi, like, I don't think that they had a lot of carryover, although Joe Rossi was kind of vetted last time around. Like that was the name on the list in 2021 or 2022 in terms of new defense coordinators. So I think the other significant difference is the point I was like, when Al Golden was hired, Marcus Freeman really needed a former head coach on staff because he didn't know how to be a head coach. Hell of a lot more experience in the head coach's offense now than there was 3 years ago. So that experience for Chris Ash, maybe not as important, but it's still something that we know Marcus Freeman values.
And I'll be curious. I don't know if we'll ever find this out unless it's high enough with tax forms. But from my understanding, Al Golden was making an average of $2.25 million per year as a coordinator with his last contract. That's among the highest in the country, if not the highest this past year.
Mm-hmm.
From my understanding, I think with Chris Ash, you only got to pay him about 70% on the dollar of what Al Golden was getting. Not that I think anyone really outside of Jim Knowles who was available is worth Al Golden type money, but that'll allow you to spread the wealth on the rest of your staff. And again, presumably give Mickens a co-title and a pay bump with that as well to keep that staff intact. I know there's some speculation about Mike Mickens, I think, potentially going with Al Golden to the Bengals. I'm not nearly as plugged into the NFL as some other people are, but I would expect him to stay.
I would too. That was sort of, I think I heard that at every turn, like Mike Mickens will stay on the staff. That doesn't mean that there could be a twist there, but all signs point to that. And it's like, I'm glad you brought up sort of the air quotes big name, because Marcus Freeman was a big name when Notre Dame hired him. and it was between LSU and Notre Dame, and they ultimately scored him from Cincinnati. Like Jim Knowles was a big name, but like there wasn't really another big name on the market. Like I don't know who Notre Dame, as much as I thought that Notre Dame would swing maybe a little bit bigger. I don't really know who they would have swung with other than Knowles. And it
I
sounds
have
like
no idea.
they had some conversations, but like never really got off the ground.
No, I mean Blake Baker's not going anywhere at LSU. He's technically the highest paid in the country right now. I mean, maybe there's an NFL guy out there you could have convinced to come, but there was not even putting together a candidate list, and we both had ample time to do that because we knew Al Golding was probably leaving. It was kind of hard, right? There weren't a lot of obvious names on there outside of the suspects you just mentioned. Jim Leonard, who I think ultimately wants to stick with the NFL. Joe Rossi, I think, is one of the more underrated defense coordinators in the country and whose name has been up there for big jobs in the past. But there was not. I mean, I don't want to say it was Jim Knowles or bust, but like there was Jim Knowles and there was everyone else, and that's ultimately there's a reason he's making $3.1 million from Penn State, and Ohio State right now needs a DC. Oklahoma still needs a DC. They probably thought they had Jim Knowles. Similar situation at Penn State too. Anthony Poindexter on staff, I think, was in line for promotion. Is ultimately going to stay with probably a fancier title. But I want to again, no disrespect. I don't think Mike Mickens was ever a serious candidate to become the DC. So like this narrative out there that they passed over Mickens. From my understanding, Marcus Freeman told everyone on staff he's putting this. He's casting a wide net. He's going to open up the search, and I think that was understood by anyone. I don't think there's any beef or bad blood or anything like that, but I do find it funny how certain names just get out there as like, we can't lose this guy. We saw it with Mike Elston, and to his credit, he killed it at Michigan, but they just I just don't think that's reality.
Yeah, I don't, and I feel like you and I were probably the only, not only, but like there weren't many people that were like, hold up, they're not just going to promote Mike Mickens here.
We were
where a lot of people seem to be fed that like the next defensive coordinator is on staff already, and like I mean this was way before the national championship game when it was pretty clear Al Golden was going to leave. I was flat out told like Marcus wants to like have a more broad search of this. He feels like it's a big position that is going to attract good candidates, and he likes Mike Mickens as a coach, but that's different than leading a room 365 days a year and calling a defense on 12 or in this case 16 Saturdays that didn't feel like he was ready for that. And like I think we've seen what happens when you roll the dice on inexperience before. It usually doesn't go well, and I realize Marcus is a walking example of sometimes it does really go well. But if you're a head coach, even with the stability that he's created for himself with the contract extension and all the wins this season, that's just not a risk you could or should be willing to take.
No, not when you're coming off a national, you're coming off a national runner-up finish. Like the sky is literally the limit as far as who you should go after, who you could go after. Look at the guy you just had and where he's ended up, right? Like Al Golden was as good as it got at the college level these past 2 years. It's again, nothing against anyone on staff, but you got to open it up. You got to, to be fair, I think me and you both heard similar things about Jared Parker before he got the OC job, and he ultimately got the OC job. But again, Notre Dame as an operation was night and day 2 years ago from where it is now in terms of like having it stuff together with all things football and being serious.
Yeah, and I think that's, the head coach is so far advanced now that, I mean, that was coming off of year one, right? Now we're coming off year three, like 3 times as much experience and a run to the national championship game. I think Marcus Freeman can come into any of these situations and be like, I know what I'm going to do, and you're going to help me get it done, opposed to, what do you think? Let's collaborate. And that's not to say that Marcus Freeman doesn't sound people out for advice, but I just think he's much more sure of himself in these kind of hiring situations than he ever would have been before. I guess, it's like among the big names, this is a segue into USC talk. Danton Lynn would have been a big name, and he's USC's defense coordinator, moved from UCLA. I think that was a name that maybe had been floated for Penn State and rebuffed.
He signed a new deal right after the Penn State thing. He wasn't available.
Going the other way on USC, Notre Dame sort of general manager, personnel guru, Chad Bowden, a $1 million job with USC which sounds like basically tripling his pay from Notre Dame. That's been interesting to sort of report out as well, because it's kind of one of those things at the time you're like, oh my God, like what's happening? Almost like the sky is falling vibe. And the more you dig into it, you're just like, well, I think not that like Notre Dame's going to automatically upgrade to the position, but there was certainly no panic around Notre Dame about this. And I was told flat out, like if Notre Dame wanted to match, felt like it should match, it would have. And Chad Bowden is at USC.
Yeah, I think triple's the right price. I forget where I read this. USC is a private school, so we'll never know for sure. But someone reported it's a 3-year deal with USC. So hopefully, for his sake, he still gets paid no matter what happens on the field the next couple of years in LA. But I was, as far as Friday news dumps go, I think I was picking up my kids from school when that broke, and I was like, whoa, like didn't see that one coming. Like they fought to keep him from Michigan last year. He was one of the head coach's buddies. Marcus Freeman was in his wedding last year. I believe Mike Mickens was as well. I believe they both lived in Mike Mickens' basement, when they initially got to Notre Dame. So I was definitely surprised in that regard. I've got a mixed reaction from the Goog as far as, we're sad to see him go. We're not so sad to see him go. I know he was an acquired taste. He wasn't for everyone, especially that place. I would counter with name me a championship contender that doesn't have a rabble rouser who's always pushing the envelope. And
you got to have one, especially here.
You've got to. And I think that's what makes the search to replace him interesting, because I don't know. That's not a world. It's a new world, right? The personnel world. Like, yeah, there are people who are experts on it, but like the GM position did not exist in college football 5 years ago. And now it does. And now with revenue sharing, we're talking about a position that could equal that of the strength coach, right below the head coach, as far as who's the most important person in your building. So I was surprised when it happened. But I talked to someone in the Google who liked him, who said flat out, look, at the end of the day, this job's a lot easier to do at USC than it is at Notre Dame. And that's ultimately why he went there. And independent of whatever happens on the field with USC next year, I can understand that part of it.
Yeah. It's, you go to a place where the entire country is open to you from a recruiting point of view. That's not the case at Notre Dame. And you go to a place where you should be able to just recruit Southern California. And it's you look at USC's recruiting, and it looks very scattershot over the last couple of years with Lincoln Riley, a long way from where it was like where you're locking down Kingston Viliama-Asa and Madden Faremo. Prospects like that should not be getting away from you. I think USC has done a pretty poor job of nailing down its sort of local talent. And so I would think that would be job one for Chad Bowden. That would be going to make it a little bit more difficult for Notre Dame to recruit in that area. And I think Chad's real strength to me was like sort of the relationship part of recruiting. The management NIL spreadsheet part of being a general manager is less so. And I think that's where like Notre Dame looks at that and says like, all right, we got to do this job a little bit differently than we've done it in the past. You need a personality akin to Chad Bowden on your staff to help with recruiting, but you also need somebody with like, I think, a different management style when it comes to, if you're in charge of the NIL deal and the revenue sharing world, like those are hard decisions. There's only so much money to go around, and somebody's got to make the decision about it's going to go to player X and not player Y.
Yeah, I get a kick out of like the whole, is a college GM better than NFL GM? Blah, blah. Like the comparisons between like ultimately Marcus Freeman says, screw this, we're paying $50 million to get this player. If you're the GM and you want to keep your job, you find I'm throwing a hypothetical number out. Like there's no checks and balances. The GM's not firing the coach. In this case, it's the other way around, like it is in pro sports. So it's a whole new world. Be curious to see how Notre Dame and everyone else decides to navigate this. Sounds like Chad Bowden's bringing Dre Brown from Illinois, formerly of Notre Dame, with him, along with Zaire Turner, I believe, from Notre Dame. Yeah. John Bryce, I think, reported that last night. And it sounds like Notre Dame's got its guy in James Blanchard. It's not a done deal. He's the GM at Texas Tech. That was the name I was given over the weekend as, hey, this is going to happen. And then I got a call Monday. It was like, push the pause on that. They want to finalize DC first because Ash wasn't done yet. And they wanted to meet him in person, which I believe they did down at Mobile at the Senior Bowl this week. So I did my homework. I was not familiar with him before, but worked with Matt Rule at both Baylor and with the Carolina Panthers. Has worked with Joey McGuire from day one at Texas Tech. People I know who have worked with him speak very, very highly of him. Again, that's not necessarily my world as far as like what a guy who sounds pretty Texas through and through is going to bring to Notre Dame from a national recruiting standpoint. But the reviews so far have been off the charts.
I know I talked to or texted with a colleague of mine at The Athletic, Sam Kahn, who's kind of like our Texas expert across the state there and has written extensively on Blanchard. So thought he does a phenomenal job. I mean, there was actually a story that Kahn wrote that I was rereading last night, and obviously with a different perspective, where like the lead is like Notre Dame has the number one class in recruiting, but Texas Tech is number two. How does that happen? I was clearly in the summer. Notre Dame did not finish number one. Texas Tech did not finish number two. But his approach seems to be much more of sort of measurable traits based. Like if you're fast and long and maybe your football tape is not that good, that's a guy that they wanted to get after at Texas Tech. Now at Notre Dame, they can recruit more of the finished product. Like I do think it's easier to out-recruit Baylor if you're Texas Tech than it is easier to out-recruit Georgia if you're Notre Dame. And it's a different challenge, but it's one that you would, based on past precedent, think that Blanchard would be up for, and could have cleared that bar.
I believe he's going to be making Chad Bowden USC type money too, from my understanding.
Oh, and the cost of living in South Bend. I mean, that's like 3 times as much what Chad Bowden's
from
making.
Lubbock. Well, no, from Lubbock, yeah.
Oh, from Lubbock, yeah.
I don't know what the. I don't know. I'm always fascinated. You hear about random college towns, you think it'd be cheap to live there, and there's like zero inventory, and it skyrockets. So I've never been to Lubbock, but it does sound like, I don't know if they'll get to 7 figures. Someone told me it might. Either way, the fact that they're talking in that ballpark, I think, is encouraging, given the narrative, the incorrect narrative probably that's out there. They just wouldn't pay to keep Chad Bowden or anyone else who was left.
Eventually, we're going to kill that narrative, Matt, on this podcast. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it will die.
They fly private now, right?
Yeah, I think that happens quite a bit.
They even give them jerseys with their names on them with the playoffs and everything. But I'll be fascinated to see what he can do, what James Blanchard can do. And, you think general manager, you think of like personnel department, kind of like what Chad's building out at USC right now. Are there other hires to be made? Is he going to bring people with him? How does all these pieces of the puzzle fit into the new Notre Dame recruiting operation?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to sort of see how that will fit together. And before we get into some ACC and other talk, a couple business items to take care of. As always, I want to thank our friends at Roback.com for their support of The Independent. You can go to Roback.com and get 20% off your first order. Polos, quarter zips, sweatshirts, joggers. I've got, I think, multiple pieces on right now as we're recording this podcast. One of my favorite brands, great for golf, dog walking, and like I said, podcasting. Go to Roback.com, promo code Irish for 20% off.
And thank you to our friends at Obvious Shirts. You can go to obviousshirts.com to get independent merchandise like hoodies, crew necks, t-shirts, and much more. Some of your favorite sayings from players and coaches and from the university itself. So appreciate our friends at Obvious Shirts. Thank you to all who have been tweeting at us pictures of you wearing the merch at games and elsewhere. Love seeing it around, and hope to see more of you in it. Please get your gear now at obviousshirts.com. And a reminder to subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and continue to tune into us on YouTube as well.
All right. This is kind of an evolving story, but it popped up this morning. Ross Dellinger does a great job over at Yahoo Sports. Had a report about the ACC extending its deal with ESPN. And part of that extension sounded like Notre Dame would be playing Miami, Clemson, and Florida State more often than they have in the past. Maybe I think the way it was phrased, like you could draw all 3 in a year. I can't imagine Notre Dame would be on board with that, but at least 2 every year, opposed to 1. There's a bunch of different ways to take that, Matt, but I was curious how that struck you.
Yeah, I believe your F1 driver, Andrew Adelson, had that this morning as well, along with ESPN and David Hale at ESPN. But I don't understand the economics of it from the ACC standpoint, if I'm being honest, because they're just opting into a new deal now, and I don't know how playing Notre Dame more in a television deal with set dollars already would amplify the value of that deal. Like, I don't. Someone smarter than me can probably explain that to me. It surely makes the conference more attractive and more good games is better for everybody, but I don't know the monetary value outside of like gate revenue and television ratings that the ACC would get out of it. As far as Notre Dame's concerned, I think it's freaking awesome. Like,
Yep.
you Pete Bavacqua at, I believe, CFP Media Day talk about how he likes how Clemson has kind of become this rival and he'd like to play them as many times as
Yes.
possible. Florida State, more often than not, would be a good team. And like, there's a lot of history between the two programs there as well. Obviously, Miami too. Um, the devil's always in the details with these things. So I'll be curious, how this upsets the pecking order with the rest of the ACC. I mean, as long as Bill Belichick's there, I think North Carolina's a blue blood, or at least must see TV, right? Like, so, hey, do we want to play? And again, I don't think Notre Dame will have a whole lot of say in this, but can we sub a bad Florida State team for a relevant North Carolina team? I'll just be curious. I mean, this deal goes to 2036, which is a long time from now. How does what's like the flex component of this model? Because at the end of the day, I think it's great for Notre Dame. I think it's good for the ACC. I don't know how it changes the financial picture for the ACC, which is ultimately what
Yeah,
they want.
I mean, I think if you're going to give ESPN a better product and more Notre Dame is a better product, especially against Miami, Florida State, and Clemson, then you would be compensated in some way. And I think it's like we don't know the details of that, but I would think that for a league that is desperate to figure out a way to make Florida State, Clemson, and Miami, especially Florida State and Clemson, feel more like you can compete at the highest level. There are the financial resources here. I think I compliment Jim Phillips for figuring out a way to be like, all right, if you want to make more money, you play Notre Dame more, because that's going to make us more money, and then you can have the lion's share of that. So I think from the league's point of view, it makes it much more of a fascinating value proposition for your television partner, which is a positive. I also think from Notre Dame's point of view, if the whether the playoff stays at 12 or goes to 14, my understanding is there will be language in the next deal where if Notre Dame if it's a 12-team playoff and they're ranked in the top 12, automatic bid. It's a 14-team playoff and they're in top 14, automatic bid. By giving a little to the ACC now, not that the ACC would be in danger of not having their support in that kind of meeting, but this shores that up if it needed it. Probably didn't. And also, if you have an automatic bid if you're Notre Dame, it makes you got to go 10-2 now. Like, if that automatic bid is on the table, 10-2 gets you in every time. Certainly in a 14-team playoff situation, like the math there is you're in at 10-2, so it gives you a little bit more of I think leeway to get creative with your schedule. Because the schedule this season was bad. Nobody cares because they went to the national championship game. The schedule was great in December and January. But I think if you're a Notre Dame fan, you're probably tired a little bit of the Georgia Tech, Duke, Wake Forest, NC State games that just don't really have a soul to them, whereas Miami, Clemson, and Florida State automatically do. Even when Florida State's bad,
It's a night game.
That's still an interesting game. And so if you're Notre Dame, you're in good shape with that. I think if you're a Notre Dame fan, I should say, you should be 100% on board with this.
Oh, I think it's very fan friendly, and I think it's very Notre Dame friendly if it ultimately plays out this way. I'm still trying to understand the mechanics of how it would happen, but no question. I mean, and look, Clemson's primed to be a top, 5 team next year at the very least. I know they're not on Notre Dame schedule, but we talk about Clemson being down. They still won the ACC and made the playoff this year. It's a good program. Same with Florida State, which is 2 years away, out from going undefeated. And I'm completely with you. I mean, we've joked a lot about like Notre Dame could fix the ACC's problems by just like joining as a full member, which is not going to happen. But they are helping to fix their problems by wanting to do this. And if Pete Bavacqua was saying as much publicly, I'm sure he's saying even more privately behind the scenes about getting better games. I'm sure the Clemsons and Florida States of the world are for that. Again, I'm curious what like the Syracuses and Pitts of the world feel about that. But I think that's a good thing for everything. The other part of the ACC, and this is part of their attempt to close the gap, which is seemingly impossible financially. Notre Dame got to keep all CFP money as independent, and they got a lot of headlines out of that. Good for them. The ACC has the same arrangement. 2 years ago, they opted into a performance incentive-based model. So if Clemson goes all the way, or Florida State, or whoever, they would keep all that money for themselves and not share it with the rest of the conference. But let's get SMU on there as well. I don't know when the last time Notre Dame's played SMU there, but that's a program that's on the rise. And
because I want to. It was like late Holtz era. SMU came to Notre Dame, if I'm not mistaken.
That's penalty SMU.
Yeah, it was like 66-2. It was like Purdue, like it was Purdue or Chris Ash Rutgers level of poor football being played. So I like this move if I'm Notre Dame. I like this move if I'm the ACC. I like this move if I'm Florida State, Clemson, or Miami. I think there's a lot of upside. And frankly, if you're Wake Forest or Pitt or Syracuse, I get it. This is probably not the best look in the world, but it's a lot better than getting to a situation where you're Washington State or Oregon State. Like you got to be in a viable league, and this is a move, and a creative move at that, to keep the ACC viable. I mean, I remember talking to Jim Phillips in November, a story on The Athletic around the Virginia game, just sort of about kind of a refresh update on the relation between conference and league. And like, I think Notre Dame's been a pretty good partner for the league. The league's been a good partner for Notre Dame. And Phillips and I talked a little bit about scheduling. I think I was thinking more in terms of like whether they would play a sixth game instead of just five. Like maybe they'd add a game here or there, or Stanford would become an ACC game more often. This year
with Stanford, yeah.
Yeah. And I really didn't think about it in terms of like more games at the top of the conference from a branding point of view than at the bottom or the middle of the conference. But if you're trying to create value, this was 100% the best way to do it.
You got to think outside the box of the ACC, and in some ways they already have, right? I mean, letting SMU buy its way into the conference, which on the surface seems absurd, right? We're going to basically pay $100 million, forfeit 7 years of media revenue just so we can have a seat at the table. And what happens? They're a field goal away from, well, they did make the playoff this year, and they're a field goal away from winning the conference in their first year. I believe it's NC State. I think it's NC State, Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. There is, when the ACC announced their schedules this week, there's an early season game between ACC foes that is a non-conference game because they scheduled each other. And it's not the first time that's happened. North Carolina and Wake Forest had done that a couple of years ago as well. But like, there are no rules when it comes to this stuff, right? You've got to do what you got to do to be viable, have good games, and make more money. And if that means putting your bigger brands against a big brand like Notre Dame, there's no reason not to do it. Again, how many of these games will be home versus away? It seems pretty evenly distributed right now with the current arrangement. I don't know if that changes when you're playing a special deluxe version of the ACC instead. But, we can also talk about, Notre Dame hasn't officially announced it yet, but the ACC announced their schedule. Therefore, we have Notre Dame's 12-game slate with dates for next year. And
including Stanford at the end. After some moderate drama. Yeah.
Moderate drama, which, by the way, that game was Newt Rockne versus Walter Camp, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And it was the 1924 season, so it kind of defeats the purpose when it's the 101st season and not the 100th anniversary.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it took place on New Year's Day 25, but 1925.
And it would be played in the calendar year of 2025, so it's kind of, 100 years plus 10 months. I mean, it would have been fun. I don't know how that would have
been fun. USC, UCLA that same day, we could have pulled a doubleheader and gone to at USC, but could have pulled a doubleheader and gone to both games. But
yeah, we could do a kind of a behind the scenes with Chad Bowden at USC and then gone over to cover Notre Dame, Stanford. That would have been a cool thing to do. I understand why it would be incredibly complicated to pull off when you're just going to another team's home stadium and be like, hey, we're going to play here. Is that fine with you? Okay. But it would have been a cool venue. But as it stands, back to Stanford. The schedule next year, I don't know if you have it pulled up in front of you right now, but like,
we do the
so
beginning,
much more interesting than this year. Oh my goodness.
I mean, there are early lines available on DraftKings. Some of us have looked at this, and Notre Dame is a 2.5 point favorite.
Tim Murray, get on the show.
Tim's the one who told me this. But like, the opening, now having a bye in week 2 is good and bad. Good because it's a short week. Bad because I think it wastes one early. But at Miami, Texas A&M, Purdue, at Arkansas, Boise State. Outside of that Purdue game, and Purdue will be better. They can't be worse.
Yep.
I'm not saying Notre Dame's going to go they could lose any of those other four games. Could.
Yeah, it's like you should, if an Ashton Gentiness you are Boise State,
They're probably not going to lose Boise State, but it is a team coming off a playoff berth that took Oregon to the final play last year.
They're a team that knows how to win football games.
At Arkansas in any given year is a very tough road trip. Doing it at that time of the year when you've already played 3. I mean, you open your schedule. This year they played 4 group of 5 teams in 24. In 25, you're opening with 4 Power 5 teams, Power 4 teams, plus Boise State. You don't play any group of 5, I think, until Navy, right? Boise State. I mean, I think it's a very challenging schedule. It's a very front-heavy schedule, and if you weather those early storms, you put yourself in a phenomenal position to finish strong. But at Miami, I mean, unfortunately, we've seen how Notre Dame plays at Miami in the past with the new quarterback.
Hey, they were great just earlier this month.
They were great there, yeah, against Penn State. A&M, they're going to be better.
Yep.
At Arkansas, I think it's more likely
tricky.
It's definitely more likely they go 5-0 than 1-4. Don't get me wrong, but you could easily lose any of those non-Purdue games.
Right. It's if they started 3-2.
If you lose one early, you're probably going to lose another one on the back half of that. I would guess.
Could be. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they went 3-2 and then finished 10-2.
Right.
But it's a tricky way to start the season with a brand new starting quarterback, a new defensive coordinator.
It's gonna be hot as hell.
It will be quite warm. It's like I think we went through this with Texas A&M, and they came out just fine on that one. But next year is going to be such a fascinating schedule because I feel like it's a lot of Georgia Tech, but with Haynes Kings on the schedule, where it's like you should probably win it 7 out of 10 times, but if you play the game 10 times, that means you lost 3. And I feel like they're playing good Power 5, Power 4 competition 8 times, 7 times. I mean, I would probably include Boise State in the good Power 4 teams, even though they're from the Mountain West. But
Syracuse is coming off a 10-win year. Now they lose their quarterback. They might lose their OC, who I think was the key to that whole offense. But it's a 10-win team that beat Miami last year.
No, I'm with you. It's it's at the end of the year, so I feel like you're probably peaking if you're Notre Dame. But still, it's just there's a lot more potential tripwires to next season's schedule than there was on this one. I mean, what did we talk about in the summer? If we were doing this podcast a year ago, it'd be like, well, Florida State's probably going to be pretty good. And you never really know what you're going to get from USC at the end of the year, which proved to be true. A&M is going to be very difficult. True. And then Georgia Tech, which was not really due to the loss of their starting quarterback. But I feel like, next year's schedule has a lot. If we're having a discussion about trap games or tripwires on the schedule, there's a lot more candidates in that discussion next year than there were this year.
No,
that's fun. That makes it such an interesting season potentially.
No, I think I said this on a previous episode, but I don't think it allowed us to appreciate how good this team was till the playoff run, because 11-1's very impressive no matter who you're playing. But it was like, all right, they finally got over that NIU loss. Who have they beaten? And again, I'm not one of those they don't play anybody guys, but until we saw them literally beat the SEC champs and beat Penn State and dominated Indiana the way they did, it was like, wait, this is a really freaking good football team. Even, in retrospect, you could say the same about the way they played against Army, although I think that's such a unique game that it almost doesn't translate to anything else. But I just think you're going to know a lot about this team very, very early this season. Going to Miami and going to Arkansas within the first, 30 days of the season, I think is
with A&M at home.
Right. Is a very tall task. Now, again, the bye with A&M helps. Miami's could say what we want about them, but they were a very good team last year, capable of beating anybody at their best. Who the hell knows what kind of Carson Beck will show up for them in week 1 next year? But that will be, it won't be a louder environment than A&M, but it'll probably be a meaner one, right? Based on recent history between these two.
Yeah, I think a good chance of that. I was just sort of looking over A&M's schedule. They have UTSA and Utah State before Notre Dame. And then Arkansas has Alabama, A&M, Arkansas State, Ole Miss, legit. And then Memphis.
Alabama. You said Alabama, A&M The school
I did
Alabama
say,
A&M?
yeah, the school
Okay,
Alabama
I wasn't sure if you were
A&M.
saying Alabama and Texas A&M.
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, so that's like it's kind of like those old Michigan State warm-ups for before where they would play like Western Michigan and Central Michigan, and then have Notre Dame, and Michigan State would be 2-0 with a plus 45 scoring margin.
Number one defense in the country.
Yeah, they get blown out. So I just sort of look at the start of next year's schedule as like there's going to be a lot to prove in a very, very short amount of time for Marcus Freeman. That's going to be fascinating to sort of see how it unfolds.
Yeah, their depth got tested to the very end this year. If there's one like true regret with those injuries, regrets are not the right word, but I wish they had a full defensive line to see if they maybe could have got pressure on Will
Yeah.
Howard and maybe had a chance to win that game, a legitimate chance, which just he had all time to throw, and that was that. But this one, I mean, look, they're not rebuilding, but they are reloading on a number of key positions, particularly up front on the defensive line, new quarterback. It's going to be very interesting just to see what Notre Dame team. I mean, you've said this before. Notre Dame openers have historically been pretty indicative of the kind of season they're going to have, and yet they've really had every kind of opener in the last 5, 6, 7 years between the close call of Florida State, which ended up being like the rockiest 11-1 season of all time.
That was fairly indicative.
Last year, right? I guess last year was indicative of the season, but not week 2. It's just I'm very fascinated by it. I'm frankly a little surprised Notre Dame is, just because of the Carson Beck hype and because we don't know who played quarterback in Notre Dame. I'm a little surprised Notre Dame is like the betting favorite right now. And it's always fascinating to see like the preseason lines, early season lines versus the reality when that game actually kicks off.
Yeah, Miami. It's Look, were you at the 2017 Miami game?
No, heard.
Okay,
Still hear about it.
It's for the best, but yeah, it's like you can have that performance, or if you're Miami, you can have all the Mario Cristobal performances where you're just like, what are you doing? Right. So that'll be a great opening week game. I cannot wait to sort of get into that a little bit more. Although it's January 30th is recorded, so I can wait just fine.
August 31st, 7 months in one day.
Yeah, and I mean I don't think there's an official date for the start of spring practice yet. I would assume the spring game would be late April this year, but I think at this point. Oh, one other thing, like they have a roster for the spring semester up on the website, and Jason Onia is back on it, which is like a bit of a news bit potentially that would be helpful for next year's team. But yeah, I'll be interested. I don't know when we're going to get with Marcus Freeman again, but it's like how winter workouts as you get into spring practice had to be adjusted, edited, curtailed because you were playing football as long as humanly possible for a college football team. Like, probably doesn't make sense to have your winter workouts be their traditional type stuff after playing a season that went to January 20th.
No, and I assume they'll have a spring game because it's a good community event, but you're hearing more and more schools get away from it because it's just like it's an advertisement for everyone looking in the portal to say, hey, look how good our freshman receiver looks. Like, might want to keep your eye on him. So I'll be curious of what they try to do in that regard. Just to go back to Miami real quick. Like, I believe A&M was like a 3 or 3.5 point favorite most of the offseason against Notre Dame, which or that part surprised me just because there were more questions with A&M going into last year than I think there are with Miami going into this year. But regardless, very enticing first month for Notre Dame next year. They're 3 or 4 more games more exciting, I think, than the second most exciting game that they had last year from a scheduling standpoint. And that's, again, a win-win for fans. We haven't talked about, just mentioned some roster stuff. Portal, since we last talked to you guys, 6 guys went in, 3 linemen, Sam Pendleton, who's at Tennessee now, Rocco Spindler, Pat Coogan, then Ty Chan, who's at UConn now, Deion Colsey at Miami of Ohio, and Jaden Thomas.
At Virginia.
Did that happen yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't see that.
The ACC giveth and taketh away.
Well, they got Malachi Fields for Jaden Thomas. I think they'll take that trade.
Yeah, I think so.
In the moment when you see 3 linemen with starting experience go in on the same day, I think your first inclination as a fan to freak out. But when you take a step back and realized they were the only one of two teams that could actually enter the portal that day. And you see that Notre Dame had a grand total of 6 portal entrants. That's one of, if not the lowest, non-academy numbers in the country. I mean, that's a win, even though they'll miss, some of those guys, some more than others. I mean, I think Pat Coogan's probably the biggest surprise and the biggest meaningful piece as far as who's leaving. I don't know who takes the mantle for the pregame speeches next year, although I'm sure there are no shortage of candidates within that O-line room. But I mean, if you look back at the week 1 depth chart last year, it's pretty much all intact. Add Charles Jack. I'd say the camp day 1 depth chart, Charles Jack it's pretty much all intact. So it's a numbers game. I believe you texted me this, like Sam Paladin probably wasn't going to get on the field as a starter at Notre Dame this year, and he's going to Tennessee immediately and will all but assuredly start immediately. Like, that's the abundance of riches situation that Notre Dame finds itself in with offensive linemen. Probably the position that, from a percentage standpoint, is least likely to go in the portal and therefore the hardest to find. Notre Dame rarely goes there except for Kane Madden from Marshall a few years ago. And who can blame them? I mean, they've, against all odds, I mean, this was a line that had so many question marks in August, ended up finishing looking nothing at all like the one that started the season, and still played really, really well throughout the course of the season.
Yeah, I know you referenced Al Washington as your assistant coach of the year. Like Joe Rudolph he killed it this year. And yeah, it's like Notre Dame will lose. They lose 4 offensive linemen, 3 of them with starting experience. They're all going to be penciled in as power 4, maybe power 2 starters. And when your 6th, 7th, and 8th guy can just walk into a playoff aspirant type of school and start, like, that's pretty incredible, especially when your line is going to return. It's arguably its top 6 guys, definitely its top 5 most talented, not just this year, but next year too. Like, they could return all 5 starters in 2026.
I wouldn't get away. It's possible. I wouldn't get that far.
No, I wouldn't. I'm just saying it's possible. It will be. It could. 2026 could be a year where it's like, oh, okay, this is all set up. It's in part because you'd have a returning starter at quarterback and potentially 5 returning starters at offensive line. So that's so far over the horizon, but it's at least like making a note of it now.
I'm looking now at the schedule. They play in Green Bay in 26. I believe they open the season in Green Bay, or week 2. So that'll be a fun one against Wisconsin. Luke Fickell versus Marcus Freeman. Any connections there? I do. I don't know if you. I think you may have seen this. I don't know. Basketball has kind of been pushed to the side here with all the football success and talk. But Micah Shrewsbury had a very funny moment in his post-game press conference when they came back to beat Georgia Tech the other night, where he read a text that came to him from an anonymous fan mid-game, just absolutely killing him for what was going on in that game, which, to be fair, I don't think it was different from what a lot of fans watching in the stands felt in the moment as well before Notre Dame had a nice comeback. Also got to shout out the women's team. Did you see this month's Slam cover? Olivia Miles, Hannah Hidalgo, and the Allstate commercial with the starting 5. It came
I did not see that one, though.
I was watching the Knicks game last night. It came on. It's on YouTube now. Go check it out. It's about a fan rushing the court too early because a 3 tied the game instead of winning it. But the entire starting 5 looks like the Joyce Center. I believe it is filmed there, staring at him perplexingly. But like, that's big time. Like, I didn't see Riley Leonard in any national commercial. You know what I mean? Like,
hey, he was in Roback, official sponsor of the Independent. You can use promo code Irish for 20% off.
I take back what I said, but it was very, very impressive. They have a legit Player of the Year candidate in Hannah Hidalgo, and hey, you know what? They beat USC pretty damn well earlier this year too.
Right, they're a fun watch. All right, I got to wrap up. We'll be back. I don't know. Probably
there will be news, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll be back next week, and maybe we'll get back on the guest train as well. At least we got to have Tim Murray. He needs to say his piece about the season and, like, you know.
Let's get Drew Tranquil on after he wins another Super Bowl.
Ooh, that could be good too. Yeah, that could be a fun guest. Unlikely.
Also, apparently Ian Book. I saw them shout out Ian Book for making it with the Eagles.
Yeah, he's like on their practice squad, I believe. Yeah,
I saw he was signed and then cut, so I wasn't sure if he was technically
independent bump.
or not.
Yeah, that's it'll be fun to watch next week. So, all right. Well, Matt and I got to bounce. Matt and I will be back next week with another episode of The Independent. So until then, he's Matt. I'm Pete. Thanks for being with us on our latest episode of The Independent.